Welcome, everyone. I'm Ben Friedman. I'm the policy director at Defense Priorities. We're a think tank trying to promote realism and restraint. We're here today to talk about the war in Ukraine, and particularly the recent travels there of our two guests, who I'll introduce. The first is Noah Robertson, who's a staff writer for the Christian Science Monitor. The second is Rajan Menon, who is the director of grant strategy at Defense Priorities and an emeritus professor at CUNY, New York. And they have both, Raj twice, traveled to Ukraine and are keen observers. So we'll start off with some general observations about their travels and then go to broader Q&A. So Noah, do you want to give a 2 or 3 minute take on your recent trip?
Of course. Thank you for being here. Thank you for hosting this, and Raj for joining. Um, Consider two scenes. I went to Ukraine in the summer during June, when the war was starting to stalemate in that first series of counterattacks on the Russian position. And then again last month in late November and early December, to see what was going on in Kherson and some of the other recently liberated territory in the south. While I was there, we based out of Mykolaiv, which is a city about an hour west by car from Kherson. And we were visiting both the city and the villages surrounding it, which were struggling to recover. In Kherson, you go and drive through black ice because the winter is so icy cold in Ukraine. You see people walking across the city center, which only months ago was the place where Vladimir Zelensky visited, declaring the beginning of the end of the war was at foot, and people triumphantly celebrated in throngs, saying that this was finally the liberation. Um, Now it's where people walk to pick up water from a giant tanker, which holds the only potable water in the city, at least when I was there in early December, to go and cook and to drink at their home. It's the place where people without electricity or heat go to sit in tents, which they call invincibility points, so that they have a hot drink or the ability to charge their phones. Um, and it's one of the only places that feels deserted in a city that is struggling to regain its population of 300,000 from the beginning of the war, and now down to 70, 80,000, given the government's estimates. Now move about, again, an hour and a half west and north from there to a village outside of Mykolaiv, which is Partizanska. Village had a population of about 1,200, maybe a little bit less before the war, since been reduced to about 26. The entire village is destroyed. It was 6 months on the front lines. You can walk through the streets and see craters where the Russian tanks were leaving shells hitting the entire village. Everything is destroyed. Um, and the families are coming back to start to rebuild, but they don't have the resources. The supply chains often are broken. The government doesn't have enough to give them. These are scenes of Ukraine in a war that's now become one of attrition, as much as that becomes a Washington cliche. The government doesn't have enough resources to provide for all of the needs of its citizens, and the citizens' needs are so diverse. And the visit that I had recently was a reminder of how much need there is, both for Ukraine to be supplied on the humanitarian civilian front as well as on the war front, as we were in Kherson hearing shells just outside the city. It was striking just how resilient the citizens were that we spoke with, and yet how strangely they've adjusted to this normal of loss, of lack of electricity, of cold, and of deprivation from what we and they just months ago would consider normal. Um, and I'll be happy to unpack that and other observations as we go forward. Thank you.
Okay, Raj, over to you.
Ben, thank you for hosting this, and it's really good to be on with Noah. As you know, Ben, I made two trips to wartime Ukraine. I've been there many times before, but during the war in mid to late August, and then late November to early December. On the latter trip, unfortunately, I came back with a companion, namely double pneumonia, but I'm recovering. I wanted to spend as little time in Kiev as possible, not because Kiev is not an interesting place. There are many interesting people there to talk to, journalists, government officials, NGO workers, expatriate Americans. I spoke to all of them, but I wanted to get out beyond Kiev. And I went to about a dozen cities in the north, in the east, in the south. Some of them had been recently shelled. For example, Nikopol across the river from the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant had been shelled the day before I got there. And I was on my most recent trip, I was in Kherson, which has now become familiar to most people who read the news. It had been recently retaken by the Ukrainian forces, but when I was there, it was still under shelling. You get, as Noah mentioned, a sense of how people manage to cope in the middle of an active war. I can't think of a day when I wasn't there that there wasn't some kind of active air raid alert, including in Kiev, which is well protected, but other places that are not. So you get a sense of how people manage in a wartime. You get a sense of the enormous destruction and what awaits post-war Ukraine in terms of rebuilding. I'll just give you one thing that hasn't gotten, in my view, enough notice. I talked to people in the British NGO Halo, which does demining around the world, as you may know, and they said for every year of war, the rule of thumb is 5 years of demining. So if the war goes on for 2 years, there will be a decade's worth of demining, and demining turns out to be extraordinarily expensive. And then there's the question of what happens when the refugees and the IDPs return, because the hospitals that they use, the schools that they use, the shopping centers that they use are either completely destroyed or seriously damaged. And you can see these with the naked eye in a way that brings home the kind of viscerality of war.
Can both of you speak to the morale of the Ukrainian side? I imagine it's a little harder to assess Russian morale since you're on the Ukrainian side of the lines. But can you speak to sort of what your observations told you about morale, given that this war seems to be headed towards a sustained posture? I don't know if it will be a year or more. Potentially, there's no end in sight. So, what do you have to say about the morale? Maybe Noah and then Raj.
Sure. As I mentioned, much of the time I spent in this last trip was speaking to civilians, especially in Kherson and around that area. Many of them shifted between two states of mind. One is what they feel, the loss, the devastation, and others what is necessary and what is day to day life. We were talking to people trudging water back and forth from their apartments so that they could cook and drink for the day. And I asked them how this feels. Does it feel like survival? Does this feel like living? And the answer was that it was survival, and that if they spent too much time thinking about the emotional side of this war, then they would break down. So they shift into the gear of what's necessary. And in that way, morale becomes almost less of a question than how are you going to get food on the table for that day. And the villages, as I was speaking, as you walk through that devastation, you have no ability to function, no ability to rebuild your home, especially with limited help and agreement from Kiev, unless you're able to only focus on what you can do for that day to move beyond the homes that you spent years building and then lived in for decades, where you raised children and had farms, where you made your livelihood, unless you focus on what is necessary. So I find that people are able to rise to that challenge and do the work that is required of them, but also at the same time, the morale is very, very fragile given how painful the situation is, especially in areas close to the front lines.
So, Ben, you asked a good question, because when I'm asked about the trip, I'm asked two questions in respective order. One, what's morale like? And second, how long will the war last? I have a better answer for the first one, so let me give that a go. When I went back most recently, I found the situation economically incomparably worse, and that is because, as you know, starting about October 8th or 9th, the Russians began a systematic campaign of trying to take down the electrical grid that has all sorts of follow-on ripple effects for the economy as a whole. And so people had, even in cities like Kiev, gone for days at a time without electricity or water. When I would ask Ukrainian friends, what can I bring for you? They would say rechargeable lights and battery packs for my computer, please. But I did not see any diminution of morale on the part of civilians or soldiers. What the civilians seem to have concluded is that the people at the front who are fighting the war are going through far worse than they are. And as bad as their hardships are, they ought not to complain. And in fact, they ought to be trying to live life as best as possible. Somebody said to me, the way we honor our soldiers is we try to live our life because that is what they're fighting for. Now, that having been said, are people tired and weary and are they exhausted? Absolutely. The soldiers, I was particularly interested in the military morale, and I didn't do a poll, so I can't give you scientific findings, but I talked to enough soldiers. I did not see any diminution of morale. The bumper sticker summation of what they would tell me boils down to this, that we have no choice to fight this war because if we lose the war, unlike the Russians, we will lose our country. And so everything is on the line. They know, however, I think the soldiers in particular, that this is going to be a long war, but they're girded for it. So my worry about the Ukrainian side of the equation is not so much what goes on the battlefield, although today there have been some significant reverses. It is whether the Ukrainian economy will be able to sustain the increasing burden and whether the West will be able to meet what will be an increasing bill that will come due from the Ukrainians to keep the economy afloat. But to the short answer to your question is I did not see any diminution of morale relative to August when I went back recently, even though conditions are much, much worse.
Yeah, and we'll come to those battlefield developments and hopefully to the U.S. Support and its sustainability. But I wanted to ask first about the divisions among Ukrainians or lack thereof. I mean, there are. It seems to me in media depictions of Ukraine, we get a sense of Ukraine as totally unified, and of course that it's a necessary simplification, maybe, but it can't be true. There are politics there and divisions, and I wondered, Noah, first, if you could sort of speak to some of the divisions within Ukraine when it comes to morale or when it comes to the politics of the war, or anything as you see it.
I would first signpost some political divisions. You have overwhelming support for Volodymyr Zelensky and the job he's done as a wartime president, effective not only in getting aid to the country, but also unifying it. And it was a very diverse one, and sometimes a very separate, kind of divided one before the war as well. But at the same time, you do have rumors that Zelensky has barred Zaluzhny, the head of the armed forces, from visiting the front, that Zelensky and his office have also polled to see whether Zaluzhny's political party, if he were to start one, would be popular with the Ukrainian public. And aside from that, more locally, you also have talks sometimes among activists that the governments in these regional centers, particularly Kherson, where I was based, um, are just as corrupt as they were before the war. We spoke to one activist who mentioned in particular that the regional military administration's leader does not sleep in Kherson, does not understand the challenges of those who were living through the lack of heat, the lack of water, the lack of electricity, particularly after liberation came and the Russians basically sacked the city. Um, Aside from that, you have natural divisions that just come from the situations that were before the war being compounded now during it. Um, we spent a lot of time traveling from west to east. When you go from Lviv to Mykolaiv, it is like you are in a different country. Lviv, the streets are full of people shopping for tourist gear. There's Christmas music playing in the streets. There's Christmas lights on the buildings around them. You can walk around and buy patriotic tchotchkes that say, like a mug my interpreter got me, a smoothie Ukrainian style with an arm holding a Molotov cocktail. You have in Mykolaiv, in contrast, at night, no lights on because sometimes there aren't lights to turn on given the lack of power. You have limited grocery stores open. And all of these things create a sense of limited division just naturally. At the same time, there's overwhelming support for the war effort and to retake all of the territory, returning it to the 1991 or the breakup or the post breakup of the USSR boundaries. Despite the natural division that comes with either political instability or with the geography or territory separating the different experiences of the war, you do have a great unity and the national goal of retaking Ukraine's territory.
Ben, as in any country, there are linguistic and cultural divisions in Ukraine. The more so because modern day Ukraine, which I mean post World War II Ukraine, is a fairly young country in the sense that Ukraine, in its current geographical configuration, has been such only since 1945. Before that, in prior centuries, it was part of various different empires, the Russian, the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, the state of Poland thereafter. And the old saw about Ukraine tends to be, well, there is the kind of non-Russophone West, centered around Lviv and places further west, and then the East and the South that's Russophone. There is some truth to that because if you look at the elections before 2014, Yanukovych's Party of the Regions, which is seen as the pro-Russian party, did much better in the East than it did anywhere else. But I think the East-West or West versus East and South distinction can be a little overdrawn. And if I understood Noah correctly, I'd like to agree with him in the sense that one of the things that the war has done, and I don't want to exaggerate this, it's created a kind of a transcendent Ukrainian nationalism where there is a sense that Ukrainians, regardless of faith or what their first language is or where they live, now face a common challenge. I will also tell you something that I observed personally, but also was told repeatedly by friends. That is that younger Ukrainians who are even Russian speakers are beginning to transition to Ukrainian sort of as a patriotic gesture. I'm often asked, well, if you speak Russian in Ukraine, are you in trouble? It's absolutely not the case. I mean, I don't know Ukrainian, I do know Russian. I ran into no grief when I spoke Russian, and Russian is freely used at military checkpoints by soldiers whom I spoke to. It's ubiquitous in Kiev. There is a language policy that will move Ukraine more toward making Ukraine as the national language. There's some division of opinion on this, and it will remain to be seen how it plays out. But I think the war, in a sense, has changed the nature of Ukrainian identity without in any way erasing some of the divisions that I spoke of.
Yeah, I mean, along those lines, do either of you feel that Zelensky has limited options for political reasons, either because of, well, it seems primarily because of this patriotic fervor that's naturally come about in Ukraine? I mean, in the United States, we look at it, at least a lot of us, and wonder, at what point there might be, a more sustained push for diplomacy to, end the war. And there's all sorts of controversy, of course, about the conditions under which that might happen. But perhaps we underestimate the extent to which Zelensky's hands are tied by the politics of Ukraine. So I wonder if either of you could speak to that.
Yeah, I would argue.
No, go ahead.
Sorry, I would argue that the both are mutually constitutive. Zelensky is pushing to retake the pre-February 24th boundaries, and then also to retake Crimea and the areas of the Donbass that were under fire from the Russians since 2014. At the same time, the public also understands the existential threat that is the Russians' war against them, and will, it seems, not accept anything less than that. So I would say that the both influences the other, and for that reason, you do end up with the situation where there isn't much likelihood for any sort of negotiations to come in the near term.
So a word about Zelensky. He is extraordinarily popular now, but that was necessarily not true before the war. There were mutterings of corruption. There were complaints that he had brought people from his Russian-speaking hometown, Kryvyi Rih, which is south of Kiev, and put them in the government. Zelensky is a native Russian speaker. He also happens to be Jewish. And I would say that the war has transformed him in two respects. He could have easily gotten out of the country. He chose not to do it. Any number of countries would have given him safe haven and evacuated him. And there's a report that he said, "What I need is not a ride. What I need is ammunition." So he's seen as a unifying force. I would say the second most popular person in Ukraine now is the commander in chief of the army, uh, um, Zaluzhny, Valery Zaluzhny. And there is some concern I heard on the part of some Zelensky people about whether Zaluzhny himself would choose to go into politics and run for an election. And the general sense is that he would give Zelensky a run for his money. Zaluzhny has repeatedly said, "I'm a soldier, not a politician. I have no interest in running." The third most popular person is another military person, Alexander Sirsky, who is the commander of the ground forces and who masterminded really the repelling of the initial assault from the north by the Russians on Kiev. There is a fair amount of sniping by the Poroshenko people. Poroshenko ran against Zelensky in the last election and lost. Poroshenko sees himself as a more experienced politician, authentically more Ukrainian, better connected to the West. Not any longer, but he saw himself that way at one point. And there's a lot of sniping. Now, as to the prospects for a peace settlement, I don't think it's so much Zelensky or any other individual. It is that neither side believes that it is losing the war. Now, we can say they're wrong, but neither side believes it. Furthermore, both sides believe they can win the war. That is the fundamental structural impediment for peace settlement. I hear people talking about the need for diplomatic solutions all the time, and I completely understand why. Escalation, human suffering. If you visit Ukraine and see the destruction, who could not want this war to end? But I see no prospects in as far as the eye can see. And I say this guardedly because there have been so many predictions about this war that have proven wrong. I see no prospects for a negotiated settlement anytime soon. And if there were a negotiated settlement, one can see it coming about in different ways. So the
Mhm.
short answer is Zelensky remains popular. The military leadership remains popular. The army is revered. As for peace settlement, it's not whether Zelensky can do it or not. He would catch some flack if he was seen as giving away too much. It's that he and his advisors themselves don't believe that there should be a. They think that a ceasefire will simply give Russia breathing room to regain the offensive. The Russian condition so far has been the precondition for peace negotiations that is that Kiev must accept the annexation of the four provinces. That's a non-starter. Zelensky's opening bid is that you must evacuate all territories, including Crimea, and agree to war crimes tribunal. That's a non-starter for the Russians, and so we're at a deadlock.
Yeah, if war is politics by another means, I mean the solution in a tragic, bloody way to the stalemate, political stalemate that you described, Raj, is on the battlefield. So turning to that and its relationship to the diplomacy, what uh, are developments now? Uh, it's winter, so there's a lot of talk about the slowing down of the war. But are developments now static, or are we seeing movement towards any kind of sustained advantage for either side? There's some talk of Russian progress. The Ukrainians obviously had some great success uh, some months ago in taking back a bunch of territory. So, what's kind of the state of the battlefield, and how does it potentially impact the politics of the war?
Right. So for the military wonks out there, at the risk of some oversimplification, I will say this. From the early stages of the war, if you set aside the fact that the Ukrainians defeated the drive on Kiev, the momentum was largely on the Russian side. They occupied large swaths of the east and the south and almost succeeded in making Ukraine a landlocked country, which would have been really bad news indeed. Then the momentum shifted, and Ben, I know you're aware of all this. The momentum shifted in about since September, and the Ukrainians have taken back about 40% of the territory the Russians were either in or occupied. At the moment, the main theater of action is in the Donbass, and there are two defense lines to watch there. In Donetsk province, it's a line running from Soledar, which is a city that the Russians are just about to take now, through Bakhmut, which the Russians have been trying to take for months now, down to Vuhledar. So that Donetsk line is what the Ukrainians are trying to defend to prevent further Russian advances westward. As for the Russians, the main defense line is in Lugansk, from a city in the north called Svatova down to Kremina. There's significant fighting in both fronts, especially in Kremina. And the Russians have to hold that line because if they lose control of that line, either fire control or a total breach, it opens up the way for more advances eastward. I don't see any advances immediately for two reasons. There's exhaustion on both sides. They've lost a lot of people. They've expended a lot of ordnance. The ground is still too slushy and it's hard enough. And so I don't see anything happening for the moment. There are various theories of what might happen when one or the other side launches an offensive, but that's roughly the situation now. Some people have called it the war is a stalemate. I don't think that's accurate because if you look at what has happened since September, there's been anything but a stalemate because the Ukrainians have gone and taken back a lot of territory. At the moment in the East, there is a stalemate. It's like World War I trench warfare with fighting over literally yards and feet per day.
And if I can add to that too, the strategic importance of Soledar is that the Russians are now, as they fight for Bakhmut and end up in this stalemate, at least in that city, trying to encircle Ukrainian defenses in the same way that they did in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk earlier, which were two of the bigger victories in the war after the initial invasion in February. Right now, it does seem like the Wagner Group, which is leading the invasion in that part of the east, it has advanced on Soledar and will soon succeed in taking the city. Though there are competing information coming out of that operation. Bakhmut, as described to us by our sources in the military, is like Verdun from World War I. Soldiers and artillery divisions cast lots. They roll dice to bet who will be the next that ends up in the hospital. And according to reporting from the time I was there, from those who were actually in the military hospitals, speaking to the Ukrainian doctors treating the soldiers that were coming in, it was anywhere from 50 to 240 a day, which is just staggering losses. Bakhmut is a city almost completely leveled from what was once a winery city of just tens of thousands before the war to now an urban ghost town. Meanwhile, in Zaporizhia and Luhansk, the Russians are fortifying their defensive positions along the 600-mile front line in the east and south of the country as they try to anticipate where the Ukrainians will strike next. And just to pick up on what Raj was saying earlier, well, both sides do believe that they both are winning and have an opportunity to win this war. What makes it so unstable in the current moment is that neither side looks at the current state of affairs as an acceptable outcome for the war. Therefore, you have a lot of instability as both sides try to make a break or a major counteroffensive as we approach the freezing of the land in the winter, which will allow more vehicles to roll.
Just a quick addition, then if I could, I'll make it very quick. My own view, and I could be wrong about this, there is just a lot we don't know. And I think Noah and I talked earlier about the many things that people don't know, but will confidently assert to be the case. And I want to tell you that there's just a lot that I'm learning that I don't understand. And some of what I say may not come to pass. But my best judgment is this. It looks like the Ukrainians will lose Soledar. And they will have to evacuate the city. And already Zelensky seems to be preparing the country for an exit from Soledar. I'm not 100% certain, but it looks very bad for Ukraine. The belief of some is that the Ukrainians will move west from Soledar, there's a river to cross, and then drop down and attack Bakhmut from the north. And that Bakhmut then will be attacked from multiple directions. Bakhmut, by the way, has been under attack for about 4 months now, maybe longer. I'm skeptical that taking Bakhmut will be very easy because it is a much bigger city. It is heavily fortified. And even in the months that the Russians, the regular troops and the Wagner troops have been fighting, they haven't yet approached the major outer perimeter of the defense line. And when you come north from Soledar, there are various other defense lines to cross. It doesn't mean Bakhmut will not fall. That's not my prediction. But the idea that Soledar falls and Bakhmut falls and it's game over is wrong. There's another way in which it's wrong. It is true that if Bakhmut falls, you open the road to Kramatorsk and to Slovyansk. But those are also heavily defended cities, and the Ukrainians have had a lot of time defending them. And there is a tendency of the Russian army for the troops to outrun its logistics, and they haven't solved that problem. So, as important a victory, at least symbolically, as Soledar is, especially for Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner group, I think it has to be put in perspective. I think it's an important victory, but not in any sense decisive for what happens in the East.
And if we can add in too, last summer when Lysychansk fell, there was speculation all around different circles that next was Slovyansk, and the battle would accelerate and the lines all the way up to there. When in reality, it stopped in Bakhmut, and now that's when the fight has been for the last 6 months or so. So, regardless of what the speculation will be, and there is a lot of speculation, we don't know how the lines will advance, and there's nothing that's going to happen quick, it seems.
Yeah. Delving deeper into the tea leaves or the things that are on the verge of being unknowable that we can at least speculate about, though, let's talk about sustainability. There was a report today that the Russian artillery fire has diminished in its frequency. At least the report I saw said it's unclear whether or not that's due to a breakdown in their ability to produce or get artillery, so they're rationing it, or whether or not it's a tactical shift. Certainly, Noah, you mentioned the heavy losses Ukraine has suffered in men. So there are some questions of sustainability on both sides. It's hard to say. Of course, we have this, ongoing effort, Russian effort to bring up reserves. So, could either of you speak just to the question of either side, how if they're capable of being in it for the long haul? Raj, I know when you recently wrote a New York Times article about the economics of Ukraine's war effort, so I hope you can speak to that. But Noah, you want to answer first?
Sure. I think the first note that I would strike is artillery and the ammunition to replenish it. Artillery has been huge in changing the fares of this war since the Ukrainians got HIMARS last year. It's allowed them to advance and to succeed so much in these counterstrikes that regain so much territory in their lightning offensives. And yet, right now, they're firing, by some estimates, as many shells in a week as the U.S. can make on its own territory in a month. That is not sustainable. Even if we had about a $4 billion package from the administration, the biggest in the war so far, sending new vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles, and others through the Ukrainians, which they will soon be trained in, and which will help stem the tide of their losses in Bakhmut. There will be logistical challenges to keeping up a World War I style pace in the East when we're fighting with non-World War I weapons anymore. There's just only so much lead to shoot out. On the economic side, I think Raj can speak to this somewhat better, but you do have inflation above 25% in Ukraine right now from a year on, and you have GDP, according to the new figures, down about 30% from a year on end, and you have millions upon millions of IDP, internally displaced people, and refugees who have fled Ukraine. Something like a third of its population is now without its borders or without their original homes inside the country. That is not sustainable from an economic perspective, given the number of businesses that have had to shutter, the number of homes that have had to close for that. Raj, can you pick up from there?
Sure. Excuse me. The Ukrainians have been very cagey, and appropriately so. Nobody likes to go into details that might help the adversary during war about their losses. And we hear in the Western press a lot about Russian losses. We have to bear in mind that the population ratio is such that Russia can simply throw more people into battle than Ukraine can. And whether there will be a second wave of mobilization remains to be seen. Putin and his press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, said the other day there will not be. but there has been a 300,000 call up. About half of them, 150 people and change, have been thrown into war. My feeling about this is there are people who say the law of numbers will eventually prevail because Russia can throw so much more into battle. But we have seen from day one that the Russian logistical system is in really terrible trouble. And people are crowdsourcing things like vests and helmets. So you have to ask yourself, you can have a much bigger army, but if you can't equip it properly and supply it while it's in battle, right, is that necessarily a better thing? I'm not minimizing the importance of numbers, but I think it's just wrong to say, well, the Russians can throw a lot more at this, and so it's inherently an advantage that the Ukrainians cannot overcome. On artillery, the exchange ratio, that is, for each Ukrainian artillery salvo, what do the Russians fire back? Estimates have been as high as 1:20. Now, you're right that recently, as far as we can tell, there's been a diminution in the intensity of Russian fire. I don't know enough to know, and I doubt anyone does, whether that's because they're running low on stocks, right? And if they're running low on stocks, how much more time will it take to ramp up? But the artillery advantage has definitely been in Russia's favor, and their style of warfare is to unleash horrendous artillery strikes to destroy everything in their path and then to send soldiers in. On the attacks on the grid, the problem I see is that you can improve Ukrainian air defenses. But we're talking about a country that in land area, leaving aside Russia, which is most of it is actually in Asia, is the largest country in Europe in terms of land. It's a huge country if you drive through it, right? So to secure every transformer, and transformers are what Russians are aiming at because the power is generated in the West, it swings east, and then transformers distribute it. And they know the Ukrainian grid very well, the Russians, because it was connected to their grid, and they have Soviet era blueprints of how the grid works, right? So the Ukrainians face a whack-a-mole game where the Russians strike the grid, cities go without light and electricity. And clearly, when I was there in this month, the difference was palpable in terms of the degree of lack of lighting in cities, even street lights. When you drive from Lviv to Kiev, you're kind of surrounded by darkness. It was clearly noticeable. So the whack-a-mole game. Secondly, the spillover effects on the economy. And then a point that hasn't gotten enough attention in the West, there is a lot of talk about, and appropriately, about the deprivation of heat and light. But heat and light to a degree can be substituted for. You can huddle together, you can use blankets and what have you, or you can use candles, or you can use rechargeable lights. The critical thing that you cannot manufacture is water, and the Russians have been attacking water stations and worse, sewage pumping stations and waterworks. I talked to a person who is very knowledgeable about the grid. He works for a utility company, and he said to me, I worry most about wastewater treatment, the sewage system, and the water supply because you could have a public health crisis in big cities that might force an evacuation. Mayor Klitschko, the mayor of Kiev, has already hinted at the possibility that that could be necessary. And I'm not saying that's around the corner, but that's something that hasn't gotten as much attention, I think, as it deserves.
And to add, that's already happening in some of the cities that I visited. Mykolaiv, while not a humanitarian disaster, has been so damaged at this point because it used to be closer to the front that the water system is now leaching in water from the river, which is salt water. So you end up with something that's opaque, that's slightly red, and is water that you can't drink, that you can't shower with unless you're desperate, and is useless for anything other than just wastewater. So now the city residents have to go and get these giant 6-liter jugs of water to be able to do anything that involves drinking or cooking. That is a harbinger of what could come in Kherson as the water system begins to be reconnected after the liberation in November. Where a spokesman for the regional government told me that if the pipes were not repaired and the freezing temperatures took over to the point where it was not getting beyond freezing each day, then the entire city would have to be evacuated, which itself is an incredibly difficult challenge for the government.
One other point, Ben, very quickly. I'll make it very brief. There's another problem in that there's some indication that when it comes to grid attacks, the Russians are running low on missiles because they've been using the S-300, which is an air defense system, as a system for attacking surface targets. They've been using some missiles without explosives in the nose just for kinetic impact, but they've used to very good advantage Iranian drones. So the Shahid drone costs about $25,000 to $30,000 a copy, right? A missile that we supply, depending on what it is, say the NASAM or the Iris-T, the German system, it's between $1 million a pop and $400,000 a pop. It's not that it's unaffordable, because as long as we continue to supply it, the Ukrainians can continue firing it. It is, if the Russians continue attacking the grid month after month after month, how long will the required amount of surface-to-air missiles be provided by the West? And what is the long-term fix for defending the electricity grid? That is the problem.
Yeah, well, on that point, we're attempting through sanctions to deny Russia access to the components needed for precision-guided missiles, and we're also providing them with Patriot air defense batteries. So, I mean, do you want to speak, Raj or Noah, to the prospects for defending the grid through these different measures that the U.S. and NATO allies are taking?
Well, let me give this a crack. I mean, I can't speak with authority on all this, especially the first part about what effect are sanctions in terms of denying them various components like advanced computer chips and so on are having on their weaponry. I hear that it's having an effect, but personally, I just don't know enough to speak um, about it. I think that the longer term problem is simply the size of the country, the size of the grid. And at one point, there was a worry about whether there would any longer be an integrated grid, or whether it would devolve into a feudal system of a bunch of local grids that could again play havoc with public health and even hospitals and so on, in the way that we were just talking about earlier. Have we done enough to cripple Russian missile production? I just don't know. So far, they've had enough. There's been some lull in their usage. Will it pick up again? Quite likely, but I'm not in a position to tell you when that will happen or the degree to which that will happen.
Just to echo that disclaimer, humility, that I'm not an expert on the effect of sanctions on the Russian military missile production. The one thing I will say, that the logistics are just against the Ukrainians and the West supporting them in this fight. The idea that you can repair a grid as quickly as it can be destroyed by these cheap drones that they're sending over, these missiles that they're attacking with, it's just impossible. So while they are collecting supplies from other states nearby, particularly those like Latvia and Lithuania, the Baltic states, there's just not enough supplies, there's not enough people, and frankly, there's not enough speed to be able to get it done in a way that keeps pace with the destruction that the Russians are capable of.
Can we speak to the evolution in the strategies on each side here? I mean, so we have obviously a initial kind of war plan that has, for Russia, that has been roundly criticized as unrealistic, and sort of an attempt at revolution in military affairs, lightning strikes, thunder runs that left Russian forces exposed to Ukrainian defenses and sort of ended in a humiliating retreat. We've certainly seen a shift in tactics, and maybe we'll take it one at a time. I mean, what has happened to Russian strategy? Is now the strategy, relating to what you guys just said, to just grind Ukraine down and grind the hope that Russia has more patience than Ukraine and its Western backers, or what's their plan of victory here? Either one of you, feel free.
My sense is that some of the problems that we saw early on in the war on the Russian side have not gone away, and they are logistics, breakdown of equipment, and the degree to which Russian troops are abandoning equipment. Russia, ironically, has become one of the biggest suppliers of equipment to the Ukrainian army, because a lot of equipment is abandoned intact. I don't see any change there. I don't see any change there because changing one commander and bringing another one in, like Surovikin, for example, who is now the general in charge of the so-called special operation, as Putin calls the war, is not going to do the trick because there's something systemic about the functioning of the Russian military that a new commander, by waving a wand or yelling at people, cannot make go away. Secondly, I think the Russians have decided that what they want to do is to lock up all of the Donbass, maintain the corridor, that the land corridor that connects Russia to Crimea, hold on to Crimea, and then eventually take back the right bank or the west bank, depending on how you want to call it, of Kherson. That will essentially partition Ukraine. I think that Putin, if he ever indeed have the goal of conquering all of Ukraine, has decided that if he can achieve that goal, he can take home a victory that's sellable as something that constitutes a victory that he can accept and that the Russian people can accept with some degree of pride. Will this be possible? I just don't know. But I see that as their focus at the moment, and the attacks on the grid are organically connected with this effort because the war is being fought at two levels: on the ground, on the battlefield, and the in the rear, so to speak, that is the economy that supports the war effort.
I think there's somewhat of a consensus among the analysts that I've spoken to that the time is on the Russian side. As Raj mentioned earlier, a much larger country, much bigger population, more people to mobilize, even if Putin is saying that that's not going to happen for now. There at least is speculation that more waves will come. Also, they have larger stockpiles. And even though there have been speculations that they're running out of missiles, there seems to always be more that turns up that they can continue to shoot over the border. The other thing I would mention is that the Russian onslaught on Bakhmut is becoming increasingly politically important within the Kremlin, as well as it is strategically important, which doesn't seem to be much. Evgeny Prigozhin seems to think that this is a testing ground both for him and for his mercenary group Wagner. And if this can be a breakthrough, this could be some sort of harbinger of greater involvement for the Wagner group in military operations, especially along the east, and potentially, as I'm sure he would sell to the Russian public, an advance or increase in his rank within the Kremlin.
Yeah, Ben, on choices for the West, it's a kind of an odd situation we face. If the Russians turn the tide, and if the people who argue that numbers will prevail in the end and Russia will begin to restart the steamroller, if they're correct, then there will be enormous pressure on the Biden administration, or even within the Biden administration, to do more. So we will have to watch to see whether the US decides, having provided the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle, some rumors now that they may supply the Stryker armored vehicle, whether Abrams tanks will be supplied. There are some reports that the British are thinking about providing the Challenger 2. There was a report today or yesterday that the Poles are thinking of providing the Leopard 2. This is a German tank that they have, providing some into the mix. So the worse Ukraine does, if it begins to falter, there'll be more pressure. Conversely, the better it does, there'll be pressure to supply it as well, because then the argument will be, we have got the Russians on the run and we have to see this through the end. One final point on this. When I went back this time, and I don't know if Noah found this, I found actually a much more, shall we say, capacious or ambitious definition of victory. I was told over and over again by different kinds of people that now, after all that we've suffered and all that the Russians have done, atrocities and destruction and damage and death, it will not do just to go back to the pre-February 24th lines. We need Crimea as well. My own view, and it's only my own view, that if the best case scenario works out for the Ukrainians and they push the Russians to the February 24th line, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but if it happens, and then they say, well, now we want to take a run at Crimea, I think the West will split. The Poles and the Balts may go along with that. I don't think the Germans and the French will. And I, in the end, don't even think the Americans will, for a variety of reasons, one of which will be the argument that left with nothing and facing total disaster, the degree of risk of escalation increases. Now, I tried to try this theory out on some of my interlocutors in Ukraine and didn't get very far because they believe that this is a tussle between light and darkness, good and evil, and that the West stands for liberal values and they will support Ukraine and so on. My own view is that at the end of the day, every country will decide what its national interest is. And I don't think even the Biden administration will give Ukraine anything like a complete blank check. At some point, we will assess what are the risks and costs of us continuing in a particular direction and whether we ought to or not.
If I can just add on top of that, it may sound like, especially to some of us in Washington who are watching this, like a certain degree of courage or chutzpah on the part of Ukrainians to want to take back those lines even more aggressively than some of the West would want them to personally. But Ukrainians feel like it's not a choice. They see what happened in Bucha. They see what happened in Kherson. The people I spoke to while I was there said they feared walking outside lest they be detained by Russian police and then taken to a station for them to be tortured for hours. Some of the people I spoke to had been tortured for hours, even if they didn't get the worst of it. It's impossible as a country, at least for the people that I spoke to see those sorts of atrocities and then feel like you can't take back all of your territory, not only to safeguard your own people, but also to send a message to invaders that you will not be trifled with.
Yeah, I mean, let's push on that a little bit. I mean, the Raj, you said it's your view about Crimea, but I think it's also the view of most, military defense analysts that Crimea is just a bridge too far for Ukraine in terms of their capability, and I'm not sure there's enough arms that the West could pump in there to change that. So I guess the question is, are they? This is calls for heavy speculation, but I mean, are they entirely serious about that? What would it take in terms of their capabilities, if there's anything it would, if there's anything we can imagine for them to do it, or is it a negotiating, position that they want to, have a big ask before they get down to serious business after they retake the land that they really believe they can take?
Right. As usual, Ben, you ask a very good question. And the answer is, you have a good point. I don't know. So when I was told this, I thought, well, this is kind of a maximalist, heroic view. We will not be vanquished. We will take back everything. And how serious are they? But what I found is that one government official after the other told me this, and a number of people who are knowledgeable about what goes on in the Ukrainian government and are not attached to it, like a couple of journalist friends of mine told me the same thing. One of them said, I can see a deal where we don't take Ukraine and concede Ukraine, but in order for that to happen, the president would have to show that an effort was made, and he has decided that he will not sacrifice the sons and daughters of Ukraine for more gain when we have already an honorable victory. And then the person added to me, and Zelensky would have to jump into the mix and give the president cover. So is it just a rhetoric or is it seriousness? I don't know, but I can tell you that it's not just one person who told me this. A number of people told me this.
It'll also depend on the new arms shipments and what become the new red lines for the West as it continues to try to pace the war effort in the East and the South. Right now, they have HIMARS, a range of about 80 miles. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, Raj. But the Russians have said strictly you cannot equip the Ukrainians with longer range missiles, those that can shoot hundreds of miles, up to 300, which the Ukrainians sorely want. Obviously, red lines have been tested in this war. We're now talking about HIMARS, which was once off the table altogether. But if those were to become part of the Ukrainian military, if they were to be given them, then we could be talking about a more expanded operation, even one that attacks toward Crimea that would completely change the course of the war. So it's just difficult to project forward and speculate without knowledge of what the capabilities will be in the future when we're only left with the capabilities of now.
Yeah, Ben, I mentioned that we should keep an eye on whether tanks and combat aircraft follow. On the missile front, there are HIMARS of different ranges, and we've given them a particular type with a limited range. I think it's 60 kilometers, 60 miles, something like that. But the one to watch there, which the Ukrainians have pushed for, is the ATACMS system, the Army's tactical missile system, which has a much longer range. And if we provide that, that will be noted by the Russians as the US significantly and its allies tacitly getting into the war much more deeply. What the Russians will do as a result of that, I don't know. You and I have talked endlessly, Ben, about what the prospect of escalation is. And the debate never ends because nobody really knows what the answer is. But I think that at some point, if you start supplying really offensive, powerful weapons, then I think the West is drawn into the war to the degree that it cannot easily back out without losing face. But if it's winning, then the pressure, as I said, increases to see the mission all the way through.
Seems like we're at that point or past it already, that we're deep enough that backing out would be tough to the extent we're in. But I mean, shifting our gaze before we end to the Biden administration at home, what are we? What do you think their plan is here? I mean, we've shifted from saying we're not going to give them armored vehicles, and because I mean, the story I heard was that we don't want to have we don't have time, or we don't think it will work out well to train them up on them when they have Soviet systems. We've shifted to giving them Patriot missiles. There was a similar story about that we had to pull all these guys out and train them in Europe, and they already have air defenses. So, I mean, what does this show? I mean, does it just show that we're planning on a 2 or 3 year war, such that, or longer, who knows, such that we can, say we're going to take all these guys out and train them and, teach them maneuver warfare? Or what's the read on U.S. strategy now?
Well, there's certainly training in terms of combined arms maneuver warfare. And, we should remember that since 2015, primarily in a base west of Lviv called Yavoriv, the United States was training the Ukrainian army. So the Ukrainian army has been trained by the US. It's moved away from a centralized sort of top-down directive-driven army to one that has much more autonomy for commanders, that has an NCO structure. The Ukrainian army of today is not what the Ukrainian army of 2012 was. In terms of what the Biden administration will do, I haven't the foggiest idea, but I think so far they've walked a fine line between we are supporting Ukraine to repel invasion, but we're also mindful of the risk of Russian escalation. So that's why I say the provision of combat aircraft, the Army tactical missile system, and main battle tanks will be a marker of just how far they're prepared to go.
The foggiest idea, I think, is the right way to put it for me too. The lines of this war keep changing, and what is and is not off the table do as well. The one thing I would say is watch the rhetoric. At the start of the war, there were endless think pieces and conversations about whether the Biden administration wanted to weaken Russia or to let Ukraine win. And if it was to let Ukraine win, what did winning mean? And so far, the status quo in the administration has been that winning means Ukraine gets what Ukraine wants, and that they are an autonomous country that can make its own choices and decide what goals they have for this war, particularly when it comes to a negotiated settlement or exceeding territory. Watch for any breaks in that sort of front rhetoric from the administration and see if there start to be openings for negotiated settlements that are already recommended. We have heard Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, already suggesting that some sort of negotiations should be on the table. See if that spreads to elsewhere in the administration.
Isn't it weird that we have to read the tea leaves and speculate as if we're a closed society about what our government's plan is for this war that we're spending upwards of $100 billion last year on? You think we'd have maybe a little more information about what they're up to, but we have a minute left to Noah and then Raj want to briefly give any kind of concluding remarks that people should take away here.
The one thing I was told while I was over there is that if we make it through the winter, we can win the war. Right now, we're in January. It's freezing over there. The difficulties that I described at the beginning of the call are even worse now. But it seems like Ukrainians are making it through the winter. So I'll be paying close attention to what happens over the next couple of months.
Ben, we've had a rousing debate within defense priorities about what the prospects are for the war, who will win, who will not win. I am much less pessimistic about Ukraine's prospects to eke out something that can be packaged as victory than most people are. That's point number one. I could be proven wrong, but that's how I see it now. Second, I think Noah said the same thing. I don't see a quick end to this war. I don't think the conditions for ending it are present. But the West had better be prepared that on the military end and on the economic end, the needs of Ukraine will be very, very substantial. If we're in the war and we're serious about the war, then we ought to know that Ukraine is going to need a lot more help. And they have not been shy about saying this. When the US supplied the Bradleys and the French did the same, and the Germans did one version of theirs, Zelensky immediately said, I need 300 tanks and 600 infantry fighting vehicles. That gives you a sense of the escalation that we can expect in terms of what Ukraine says it needs to defend itself and prosecute the war to success.
Well, thank you both for speaking with us here. I certainly appreciate it. I imagine our viewers do. And given that the war tragically is going to continue, we'll have future events, live streams, and other stuff to discuss it. So keep your eyes on what we're doing at Defense Priorities. But thank you both, and good luck.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ben. Bye, Noah.